Alright guys, I know originally I said I wasn't going to do a video tonight, but what I want to do is just a short 10-minute video reviewing how to graph the trig functions. So tonight's homework is just going to be to review graphing these. Alright, so like I said, nice short little 10-minute quick remembering how to graph these guys. So that way our test review will go that much quicker. Alright, so we're going to start off with a cosine graph. Now, for sine and cosine, if you remember, you needed to tell me the amplitude, the period. I like to find the key point, the phase shift, the vertical shift. So I like to do this for cosine, sine, secant, and cosecant. So that's how most of your graphs are going to work. Alright, let's go ahead and get started. Okay, amplitude. The amplitude, remember that this is A, B, and C. That should be a capital A. Alright, your amplitude is the absolute value of A. So I take the absolute value of -2 and I get 2. The period is always 2 pi divided by B. Alright, so I'm going to do 2 pi divided by B. B is whatever is behind the trig function. In this case it's 1, so my period is just 2 pi. Okay? Key point. Do you remember how to find the key point? You take whatever your period was and you divide it into fourths. So my period was 2 pi. I divide it into fourths and I get pi over 2. My phase shift is C divided by B. And remember, there is a sign change. So since this has a negative, my phase shift will be positive pi over 2 over 1, which is just pi over 2. And vertical shift is if you had anything tagging along out here. So I have no vertical shift. Now what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and build that chart. Remember, you take your phase shift, and that is what goes as the first item in your chart. Now, each time, you're adding a key point to it. So I want the first phase shift plus the key point, and I get pi. I do it again. Pi plus pi over 2, 3 pi over 2. 3 pi over 2 plus a pi over 2 is 2 pi, and then finally my last one should be 5 pi over 2. Remember, if you've done it correctly, you should have 5 lines, 5 rows in your chart. This is a cosine curve. Cosine always starts at the amplitude, kind of like a pseudo amplitude, because it's going to be whatever value is here. So cosine begins at -2, goes to 0, back to 2, 0, -2. Okay, and now we would be ready to graph it. So the main thing to remember is that you always start at your phase shift, and then you add your key point to it. Okay, so this is phase shift plus key point. If you have no phase shift, then you're starting at 0. And here, because it was a -2, that's why it went down first. Okay, so that's how you would graph a sine curve. Alright, the next one I want to review with you is how to graph a cosecant. Alright, so let's say that number 2, I had y is equal to -1/2 cosecant pi x. Now, again, I need amplitude, period, key point, phase shift, vertical shift. The only ones that don't get this are tangent and cotangent. Alright, everybody else gets this. So let's go ahead and answer it. What is your amplitude? The absolute value. And you know what? Can you make this, just make it 1/2. I don't want to do two negatives. Okay, so the absolute value of 1/2 is 1/2. The period, 2 pi over b. What's b in this case? B is what's behind the function, pi. And you get 2. Your key point is your period divided by 4. So my period was 2. 2 divided by 4 is 1/2. My phase shift. Do I have a phase shift? No. And do I have a vertical shift? No. I know that I'd have a phase shift if I had parentheses. I know I'd have a vertical shift if I had a plus or minus tagging along. Alright, we are now ready to come over here and make our table. I start with my phase shift, but I have no phase shift, so I'm going to start at 0. And what am I adding each time? I'm adding a key point. So this is always phase shift plus key point. So I get 0 plus 1/2 is 1/2. 1/2 and 1/2 is a whole. 1/2 and a whole is 3/2. 3/2 and 1/2 is 2, and I've got my 5. Now, cosecant is the graph of which function? Who does cosecant pair with? He pairs with sine. So now what does sine start at? Sine starts at 0, goes to the amplitude, back to 0, the negative amplitude back to 0. Alright, let's graph him. Here's 1/2, negative 1/2, 1/2, 1, 3/2, 2. Okay, so I go 0, 1/2, 0, negative 1/2, 0. So there's my sine curve. But did I ask you to graph the sine curve? No, I asked you to graph cosecant. So if you think about what we did with these, we said anywhere we have an x-intercept, that now becomes an asymptote. So you draw those in, and then do you remember what you hook to your max and your mins? You hook a little parabola and a little parabola. Alrighty, let's try to do y equals 2 tangent x over 2. Now, tangent and cotangent graph totally differently. You need to remember that tangent oscillates between negative pi over 2 and pi over 2. And you take whatever I have here in the after the function, and that's what goes over here. Now I'm going to multiply by 2 so that I can get x by itself. So I get negative pi is less than x is less than pi. We are ready to jump over to graph. So negative pi to pi. Now if you remember, we subdivided this. So I said, what is halfway between negative pi and pi? 0. And that's where you put your x-intercept. These became your vertical limits. Now you subdivided this category from, so what's halfway between negative pi and 0? Negative pi over 2. And halfway between 0 and pi is pi over 2. Now, if you remember, the tangent curve starts low and goes high. So at this halfway point, I drop down to the kind of pseudo amplitude, and at this halfway point, I rise to it. And I'm only asking you to graph one period. Alright, last one I'm going to walk you through is a cotangent. So I want 3 cotangent x plus pi over 4. Now, cotangent is going to be just like tangent, except my limits are not negative pi over 2 and pi over 2, but they are 0 and pi. So again, I take whatever's here and it goes in the middle, and now I'm going to solve for x. So I need to subtract a pi over 4 from everybody. So I have x in the middle, a negative pi over 4, and 1 whole minus a fourth is 3/4. Okay? Now what I want to do is figure out what is halfway between negative a fourth and 3/4. So I could take negative 1/4 plus 3/4 is what? 2/4, really a half, and then cut that half in half, which would make him pi over 4. What's halfway between negative pi over 4 and pi over 4? 0. What's halfway in between pi over 4 and 3 pi over 4? 2 pi over 4, which is really pi over 2. So at this midway point is where I get my x-intercept. It's going to go to the pseudo-amplitude of 3 and negative 3. And what the cotangent curve does is he starts high, oops, put that there, and he ends low. So something like that. Alright, so I'm giving you a couple of these problems to practice. Again, shouldn't spend more than about 20 minutes on the rest of the homework. And I'll see you guys tomorrow, or I'll see you on Thursday.